Welcome, folks. We're going to give folks another minute before we jump in. Okay, well, it is 4:30, and so we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Madeleine Kerrick, and you are here at the CSU Leaders Navigating the Pandemic and Racial Injustice presentation. Thank you all so much for coming. I want to give a nod to my co-authors, Breaunna Alexander and Connie Tan, who couldn't join me today. And start by just signaling inclusive meeting practices. So as you're all already doing, keep your video off and be on mute when you're not speaking. If you have a question, feel free to come off mute or type in the chat or Q&A. If you need help, you can click on reactions and raise your hand, and our producer, Candace, will give you a hand. Ben is going to be moderating for me because I can't see you all or the chat very well. So if you have a question, he'll jump in and interrupt me and help kind of transfer over to questions. And feel free to ask questions at any point, but we should also have a good chunk of time at the end for questions and discussion. So, oh, and you can also private chat the CSUS producer for any tech difficulties. All right, and so with that, we'll go ahead and jump in. So to start off, I'm waiting for this slide to transition. There we go. To start off, I want to give a little bit of context for this study. So the confluence of two pandemics, the COVID-19 pandemic and racial injustice, magnified deep-rooted structural and social inequities across many systems. And COVID-19, as you all well know, caused major disruptions to education across the state and nationwide. And this required CSU campuses to rapidly transition instruction and student services online. And in the midst of these quick shifts, the murder of George Floyd by law enforcement highlighted longstanding inequities and forced the nation into a period of racial reckoning. And while the CSU Chancellor's Office had prioritized equity through its graduation initiative 2025 before the murder of George Floyd, the racial reckoning that began in May 2020 instilled a focus for CSU campuses to create more equity-centered institutions. Since the CSU serves a large, diverse student population, this watershed moment served as a call to action to better serve students in more equitable ways. Today, I'll share with you findings from interviews with senior and middle leaders from 7 CSU campuses about how they and their campuses responded. And to start off, we have this quote here that really highlights how participants saw the kind of confluence of these events as catalyzing processes that were already kind of in motion or that they were going towards to reduce barriers for students, but that this really just catalyzed it because, quote, we had no choice. So to jump in here, I realized I did not introduce myself. So I'm going to pause and say my name is Madeleine Kerrick, and I am Interim Director for Research for the CSU Student Success Network. My pronouns are she, her. And now I'll go to an overview. So we'll talk today briefly about our methodology, then we'll move into findings on communications and planning, and then addressing racial inequities and the COVID-19 pandemic. And then we'll look ahead and have time for questions and some discussion about how these findings resonate for you and your experiences on your campuses. So for our methodology, we selected 7 campuses that varied by region, enrollment size, percentage of traditionally underserved students, and percentage of Pell Grant recipients. And from these 7 campuses, we recruited a mix of senior level and middle leaders. And so by senior level, I mean folks like vice presidents of both student and academic affairs and provosts. And with middle leaders, we had associate deans and directors. We had a total of 18 semi-structured interviews in fall 2020 and spring 2021. These interviews were all recorded and transcribed, and we used inductive thematic coding to identify patterns across the data. So moving into our findings. With regard to communications and planning, leaders across campuses reported increases in communication and collaboration around both equity and the pandemic. However, communication about the COVID-19 pandemic appeared more action-oriented than that about equity. We'll dig in a little bit more as we move into the details of these findings. There we go. So when it comes to communications and planning around equity, all leaders from all of the campuses in our sample described ongoing equity efforts on their campuses. This included things like defining equity, making equity statements, developing comprehensive equity plans, and engaging in ad hoc or departmental equity efforts. For instance, one interviewee shared that their campus had taken on a diversity, equity, and inclusion strategic planning process that centered racism and anti-racism in everything it did. And highlighted that there's both this institutional process as well as anti-racism planning retreats, statements, and localized planning processes coming out of different departments, colleges, and groups on campus. So as evidenced in this quote, about half of campuses in our sample described equity efforts as collaborative efforts that require representation from all constituency groups. Leaders from most campuses described the creation of equity-focused cross-role task forces and work groups. Nonetheless, leaders from 4 campuses, so more than half, noted that there was a lack of cohesion in campus definitions of equity, and this presented challenges with and/or resistance to taking responsibility for addressing equity. For instance, one interviewee said, "I don't know if there's a consistent feel about what equity means on our campus." And that this lack of consistent understanding of equity poses challenges isn't surprising. McNair and colleagues wrote, quote, "To make excellence inclusive, institutions should have a widely shared and commonly understood definition for diversity, equity, and inclusion that reflect the institutional context and values." Sorry, my slide isn't moving forward. Hang on one sec. There we go. So most leaders also described increases in collaborative planning and decision-making around the COVID-19 pandemic, including some who spoke about forming new cross-divisional, cross-role planning teams. This was paired with additional or expanded communication among colleagues and with students at nearly all of the campuses in our sample. As this quote indicates, this meant frequent meetings and communication among executive leadership. In some cases, every day for several hours. There was also more frequent communication across constituencies. For example, senates, unions, and middle leaders. In this case, this interviewee talked about academic affairs being an outreach mechanism to faculty. And we also heard about intentional and ongoing messaging and outreach to students about changes and resources, and also to provide proactive advising. And as this quote indicates, this was done through a variety of mechanisms, such as town halls, FAQs, emails, and advisor proactive outreach. While there were reported increases in communication about both equity and the COVID-19 pandemic, this communication appeared more action-oriented for the pandemic response, perhaps in part because taking action around equity requires a shared definition and commitment, and lacking a shared definition emerged as an ongoing challenge for more than half of campuses. The pandemic response also required increased communication and collaboration, but the nature of the crisis may have fueled more immediate action. We'll next move to the reported actions taken to address racial inequities and the pandemic. So when it came to addressing racial inequities and the COVID-19 pandemic, interviewees described rapid and radical responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. And I am getting a low system resources warning. So if I get laggy, Ben, please let me know. So interviewees described rapid and radical responses to the COVID-19 pandemic, suggesting that such change is possible for CSU campuses when urgency and a collective commitment to change occur. In contrast, descriptions of equity responses suggested these efforts largely remained in the planning stage, with fewer apparent or urgent actions reported compared to those reported for the pandemic response. So specifically, when it comes to identifying and addressing racial inequities, my slide deck is going to freeze. So hang on one sec. There we go. Leaders from across campuses identified a number of inequities that result from institutional policies and practices. Specifically, hiring and retention inequities were described by leaders from 6 out of 7 campuses. As this quote indicates, our faculty do not reflect the diversity of our campus, neither do our administrators. And leaders pointed to the need for both recruitment practices that create diverse applicant pools and for refining formalized retention, tenure, and promotion processes to recognize the service that faculty of color do in mentoring students of color. Leaders from 5 out of 7 campuses described current efforts related to hiring and retention, including things like anti-bias training, equity and diversity advocacy, improved advertising efforts, as well as things like public-facing tools to display the diversity of faculty and staff. In addition to hiring and retention, classroom inequities came up from leaders at most campuses, including those related to course curriculum, as highlighted in this quote, about how we produce knowledge within higher education, the kind of curriculum that students are exposed to, which currently is still extremely Eurocentric. In addition, interviewees highlighted inequities arising out of students' transition to virtual learning. For example, the access to technology, not having the space to study. But despite identifying these areas as problematic, interviewees didn't report actions beyond discussion to remedy these inequities. Those from 5 campuses described inequities related to student access and outcomes and/or campus climate. And as we see highlighted in this quote, which says our underrepresented minority equity gap is almost completely accounted for by non-passing grades in the first 2 years. So it's specific courses with very high DFW rates at the 100 and 200 level. If we could close those gaps, our equity gaps would go away. So racial equity gaps came up in terms of passing rates in first and second year students, as we see here, as well as the 4-year graduation rate. And leaders from most colleges described how sense of belonging could improve retention and graduation of traditionally underserved students. But this was one of the most common challenges surfaced by interviewees in terms of making progress on racial equity. And here we have a quote on campus climate. If it's not a welcoming, inclusive environment culturally, then that itself can really threaten that sense of belonging and all that comes along with feeling like you belong. That opens up thriving, that opens up engagement. It opens up so many doors. So the sense of belonging is important too. Those from nearly all campuses spoke to racial equity-focused professional development, though one of the things we noted is that the professional development offerings weren't always tailored to addressing the inequities that interviewees brought up. Next, we move to identifying and addressing COVID-19 related needs. And I'm going to stall again for a second, so bear with me. There we go. So as noted already, campuses, and as you all well know, campuses made quick pivots from in-person instruction, student support, services, and administrative processes to virtual formats. How smoothly this went varied across campuses. Some of those in our sample had prior shutdowns due to things like wildfire that they'd had an opportunity to learn from. For other campuses, it was a rocky time. For example, due to a lack of experience with virtual instruction. What we found across the board, which again, I'm sure comes as no surprise, is that almost entirely in-person instruction went to 100% virtual instruction. And similarly, student support services pivoted. Many leaders reported student affairs made quick shifts to support centers such as writing centers and career centers. This quote highlights that for one campus, they went from about 5% of classes offered online to 95% offered online, and it was 100% online in the second half of the spring semester, or spring 2020. So that pivot was the single biggest response to the pandemic. Some leaders reported greater attendance at things like online advising and a positive reaction from students to online advising and online mental health services. In addition, shifts from paper forms were brought up by almost all interviewees. They noted that paper forms were time-consuming and inefficient, and that the pandemic led to widespread use of paperless forms for both student-facing and internal paperwork. As one interviewee put it, we've had a lot of paper forms, and they were like, they get lost. Everyone knows that. Now, almost all of our processes that are student-centered have gone into Adobe Sign, so the student can initiate it and they can see exactly where it's going. What a thought. While some leaders surfaced challenges with communication and providing for student needs online and fostering equitable learning in classrooms in a virtual environment, most described increased flexibility of policies and increased accessibility of services, resources, and education. Flexibility came up around both course and grading policies. For instance, this quote described grading as one of the areas where we've made changes because we felt like students needed more opportunities to drop courses, or they needed more flexibility in being able to take a class, credit, no credit, or ABC, pass, fail. Accessibility came up with regard to reported institutional changes, such as expanded hours, free virtual orientation, the creation of virtual one-stop student help centers, and holistic consideration of student circumstances. Leaders also described addressing needs by providing additional resources. For example, basic needs resources such as continued access to food, increased mental health support, huge provision of technology, increased financial support, and these were tailored to meet both student needs and to provide additional support to personnel during the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic. A few leaders also highlighted the importance of intentional allocation of resources, both funding and staffing, to support equity efforts. As this quote states, we're in some tough times right now about budget, and it would be really easy to say, all of us have to take a hit right now around staff or budget. And because of our strong leadership in saying, no, we've got a lot of work to do for diversity and inclusion and racial justice on our campus, we're not going to take any funds or staffing or resources right now away from that area. That's a strong leader. So, as noted by interviewees, CSU campuses, like many large institutions, often struggle with change. However, the reported rapid and radical responses to the COVID-19 pandemic serve as evidence that such change is possible for CSU campuses when there's both urgency and a collective commitment to that change. What we heard from leaders was that pandemic-induced changes have largely been beneficial, and that pandemic responses have led some leaders to question, quote, things that we've just always done that way. However, respondents described more apparent and rapid actions in response to the pandemic compared to efforts around equity. And there remains a need to examine the equity implications and impacts of pandemic-induced changes, and a need to address equity with equivalent responsiveness and action orientation. So we've put together some guiding questions based on our findings from these interviews with the goal of supporting campuses' ongoing efforts to recover from the pandemic and institutionalize comprehensive equity efforts. And Candace is going to drop a link to those questions in the chat. And within the handout itself, there's a link to the research brief that this presentation is based on. And now I'm going to open it up and see if folks have questions. I want to thank you and all of the folks that participated. I want to thank Ben for putting this presentation together, and thank you all for your time. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing so that I can actually see people. All right, and so yes, you have a guiding questions handout, and then you should also have the presentation slide deck. Any questions or comments? Did this resonate with your experience on your campus? I see Larissa's hand is raised. Go ahead, Larissa.
Hi, Maddie. Thanks so much for sharing that. I wanted to know, thinking about the conference theme, right? Just sustaining momentum for equity and change. You discussed how leaders, recognize the impact of these rapid changes that they had to make. Was there any indication that they were thinking about how they were going to sustain those changes and what they needed to do?
That's a great question, Larissa. Thank you. So in some cases, yes, one of the questions we asked is what changes have you made that you want to keep, right? What changes have you put in place, right? One that comes to mind really easily is virtual forums. Everyone was like, yeah, we're never going back. But I think, some of the leaders we spoke to were thinking really critically about this idea of, things we've always done this way. Now that we've had these shifts, what else can we shift? How can we think about those things that we don't even think about because they're so second nature and we don't examine them? How can we use this as a way to maintain change or maintain momentum? And then I think another thing is thinking about equity and the pandemic response together. Some of the leaders explicitly talked about the equity implications for the changes that they'd made to the pandemic. For instance, some noted that access of online advising was actually, students that typically didn't access in-person advising were accessing online advising more. Most commonly Black students, at least for one campus, were accessing at a higher rate. And so thinking about those equity implications and how these shifts can improve equity on campuses is something that was already kind of baked into some of these conversations. For others, I think there wasn't necessarily that conversation already happening. Other questions? And I will say, the guiding questions that we put together really are intended to help keep those conversations going or start those conversations in instances where they aren't happening. Ben, did you just come off? Oh, Renee,
I would just say you have a question from Renee.
Oh yeah, it's less of a question. Sorry, it's more of a kind of reflection. I'm thinking about. I had gone to the pre-conference with McNair and Brown McNair, I guess, and then in just watching the different sessions yesterday and today, and then landing in a meeting today on my own campus with undergraduate studies with advisors, say maybe 100 advisors in that meeting. Predominantly professional advisors. And just also, I have to say my role as a steward for those frontline practitioners and stuff. And so one of the things that came up, a couple of things came up. One was the lack of inclusion of those frontline, practitioners, right? And, Ben Simon talks about, agents, right? Practitioner agency. So that was one thing that's kind of stood out. And also just the overburden of work of this particular workforce increasingly putting stuff on there. Oh yeah, and I was at a union meeting today too, on top of that, where they're talking about the CSU increasingly different campuses are making those as people leave, which is going on, as everybody knows, and probably across the board, but definitely in this category of student service professionals, that they're replacing their jobs with the temporary workers who maybe have a year contract, but they're at will. So it's I suppose for funding purposes, but it could also be seen as a union breaking thing. And I'm just talking about quality of work. It's not very positive. And on the layers of this about sustainability, you have students who are needing, legitimately so, especially I talked in one of the last sessions about being really, most of us, but them especially, traumatized over these last 2 years, and what kind of healing stuff we're doing, or what reasonable, if you will call it a demand, is being asked for among us to really truly support them. That it's just really tough given the circumstances, and that oddly, a lot of times now folks want that remote connection, and they're like, someone from Bakersfield, I believe it was saying, like, from the very beginning, as soon as like California allowed them to go back, they were back 100%. Like at Northridge, we're still on remote part-time, and they were just saying, I'm here every day, but the students, I've only had like 2 requests, they said, this whole semester for in-person. So what I want to throw out there about that too is that we know in-person is really important, whatever those connections are and engagements, and having the students on campus. We know all the literature shows that everything. So how do we adapt to what's going on, and agree that there was maybe absurdity in some of our past practices of you must come to in-person advisement? I mean, I am embarrassed to admit that they did that in our office, right? But at the same time, looking at how do we make sure we're not losing some of the, I said this in another session, tangible and intangibles of that contact. And so I don't know, I'm throwing a bunch of stuff out there to say that I don't believe that much of what was done on my campus, and there was a lot of really wonderful, beautiful stuff done, much of it wasn't sustaining unless you had some people who were really go-getters and who really went after it. And in talking to them recently, some of them were just broken themselves in terms of the amount of workload, especially for faculty of color and staff and administrators, because that sort of taxation on them. So yes, there was a willingness. Who's the workload fall on? And I go back to what McNair was saying, where's the infrastructural and institutional commitment that looks like resources? And right now we're seeing the opposite for the frontline workers. So this is a long way of saying some good stuff, but when it comes down to it, it's about dollars and cents, and they're actually undermining that right now in very, very real terms on most of our campuses for our student professionals. Student support professional.
Thank you so much, Renee. That was amazing. Anyone want to jump on that? I don't feel the need to like follow and comment. I'd love for this to be a discussion. I know we're almost at time, but and I'm seeing folks jump in the chat. I mean, everything that you shared, Renee, absolutely. You know, we just had a convening in the spring around disaster management, and we have a forthcoming Knowledge Center memo coming out around disaster management that talks about the importance of frontline staff and including them in planning processes, because they're really the folks that are going to be doing that student-facing work, and the need for intentionally allocating resources, bringing those folks into these conversations, and is hugely important. And the cultural taxation that you mentioned, Renee, was something we did find in this study as well, right? That the burden falling to faculty, administrators, and staff of color in supporting students of color is unrecognized and unrewarded, and is often bringing folks to a breaking point. And so figuring out how to support those folks in doing that work that they're doing. Other questions or comments?
Maddie, I have a question. How would you recommend if somebody, somebody's looking at the report, they're like, I know people who, we could all benefit from this,
Yeah.
right? How should they share it? Like, what are some things that they can say to start those conversations?
Great question, Larissa. Thank you. I think that creating those conversations, bringing them to staff meetings that you have, bringing the report to staff meetings, bringing it to department meetings, depending on where you sit on campus, and really encouraging conversation around these things. Our goal isn't that this is a sit on the shelf kind of research, that this really inspires conversation and action on campuses. And so those guiding questions really are intended to help get conversations going in terms of examining what things changed for campuses and are still different even after transitioning back. As Renee mentioned, some have transitioned back whole hog, others are still in kind of a partially remote space. And so looking at what's happening and then also bringing the equity lens, right? So really examining what the implications of those changes have been and how research and data can be used at every level of the institution in terms of understanding how policies, practices are impacting students disproportionately and how to think about making shifts in those. And I know we are 1 minute over time and that you've all been in conference sessions all day. So I want to be respectful of your time. And I'll just say, yes, encouraging folks, Larissa's chat, to see their potential to create change, even when they're feeling limited in their roles, working together. Thank you all so much. And I hope you have a wonderful day tomorrow in your conference sessions. Thanks again for joining.